Good morning, everybody. Thank you so much for joining me. I am going to be speaking with you today about the anti-SAD diet. And we'll start right now. If there's any questions, please feel free to type them in the chat questions section, and then I will address those after we're done. Thank you so much. So I'm a psychiatrist by training, and I also trained in integrative medicine a few years back. So that's really where my interest in food came to be. And I think most of us are interested in food in one way or the other, and most of us consume food. So that is where this topic came to be, because I get a lot of questions about how one should change their diet, what individuals should eat to improve their mood, what they should do to support their mental health. And I figured maybe talking about that, especially at a time that we're still trying to reorient ourselves to our New Year's resolutions, to eat right, to work out, to be healthy, maybe to meditate, that this may be a nice injection of some energy and some extra information so as to help you along. So anti-SAD really for me came up because as I was looking at food, I think about how most of us are on some or the other diet every now and again. We're thinking about, how should I change things so that I can be healthier, I can do better. I'm able to maybe sometimes it's about weight, sometimes it's about how we look, other times it's about how we feel. And so we hear about all these different diets, including paleo, which says don't eat grains, don't eat legumes, just eat, high fat, go ahead and eat a lot of meat, eat non-processed foods. We also have the vegan diet, which asks you to generally cut out all kinds of animal products. And so that is another way of eating. There's the Atkins diet, which again tells you eat protein, eat vegetable sources, really try to limit your grains again. And then you have a keto diet, which talks about, again, cutting out grains and like everybody's fighting the carbs and that as well. And looking at it, each of these different diet forms have some positive data, but a lot of them are also not sustainable. So to be counting calories or to be trying to cut out whole sections of foods seems somewhat unreasonable. And most people who I know who follow these diet patterns will follow them for a little while, but then come back and say, oh, I got really sick of it, or I started craving pizza. And there's issues that come up in terms of sustainably following it. With the keto diet, we've started noticing that there's some adverse effects to the heart. And so I figured we would talk about a type of diet that is able to sustain not only your mood, but also is generally sustainable. It's possible to do. It's been followed in cultures around the world for many, many centuries. And those are cultures that are actually doing very well relatively, both physically as well as mentally. And so today we'll talk about the anti-inflammatory diet. We will discuss the role of nutritional intervention in mental health, and we'll also differentiate between some myths and facts or realities associated with nutritional intervention. So some of you may have heard about the anti-inflammatory diet. For some others, it may be a newer thing to consider. The anti-inflammatory diet is essentially an eating pattern that is derived from the healthiest components of traditional Mediterranean diet, as well as Asian dietary patterns, most prominently Japanese diet. And both Japanese as well as Mediterranean diets are associated with good health and longevity. We notice that in both these diets, some of the common factors are intake of beneficial anti-inflammatory foods, and then also reducing or minimizing foods that can trigger inflammation. And there's been some wonderful, wonderful research in the last 10 years that shows that higher inflammatory rates within our bodies from many different sources can actually reduce our sense of well-being. They can impact our mood negatively. And so really thinking about what are ways to impact inflammation just with our diet is becoming a great focus for health everywhere, and especially also mental health. So association of Mediterranean dietary pattern with the incidence of depression. There's a really famous and classic study that was done that showed that when Mediterranean dietary pattern was followed, it was actually protective against MDD, or major depressive disorder. It was a cohort study. It had about 10,000 plus participants, so that's a lot of people to gather that data from. It gathered data over a period of 4 years, and it showed that they were eating a Mediterranean dietary pattern. They continued to assess them for that type of dietary pattern. And the risk of depression was reduced by 42% as compared to the control cohort. So that really shows that that's a huge impact. We even noticed that sometimes our medication interventions are only about 50% good. So being able to reduce your risk of depression by about 40% just by monitoring your diet and changing that is a huge impact, especially because it's protective and preventative, and we all know prevention is better than cure. So the evidence for anti-inflammatory diet in specific comes from many different studies. So there's the Sanchez-Villegas study, which I initially shared, the classic study, which showed that a Mediterranean dietary pattern was protective against major depressive disorder. There was another study by Akrabali et al. In 2009, which showed that whole foods diet, which comprised of fruits, vegetables, and fish, also protected us against onset of depressive symptoms. Another study was done by Dr. Lodog. She's actually one of the faculty members who used to be a part of the fellowship program that I trained in. And her study showed that a balanced anti-inflammatory diet, which had proportionate caloric burden, was able to, along with an integrative treatment plan, increase well-being and also reduce risk of depression. And then we also noticed another study by Sanchez-Villegas in 2013, which showed an inverse relationship of depression with those who had a Mediterranean dietary pattern with some added nuts. And the inverse association essentially means that the more you followed that dietary pattern, the reduced risk of depression you had. And they also noticed that there was statistical significance, which in doctor language is that it was impressive in terms of its outcome, and which would make us actually start recommending something like this for individuals with diabetes mellitus type 2. So if you have type 2 diabetes, this has even added benefits in that realm for you. And then finally, Agrawal et al. In 2015 showed that a plant-based diet had positive impact on depression. So, in some ways, a plant-based diet could just be a vegan diet. And as we'll read a little bit more and understand about the anti-inflammatory diet, you will see that it does have just a huge proportion of vegetables, but it has a little bit more than just plant-based elements when it comes to the anti-inflammatory piece. So this is what an anti-inflammatory diet looks like in terms of a visual. So right at the bottom, you have vegetables and fresh fruits. And that really goes on to say that those are the two elements that you can add as much as you want. So if you were to feel like I'm going to follow the anti-inflammatory diet, and as you're eating, you feel like, oh, I'm not quite full yet, you can add more vegetables, you can add more fresh fruits, and that can be a great way to make sure that you're getting enough volume or calories that you need. The next level is whole or cracked grains. So again, the difference between whole or cracked grains and some of the flour we may use in things like baking is that whole or cracked grains are not processed. So this may be steel cut oats, it may be, brown rice, it may be bulgur. So bulgur is cracked wheat. And those are just healthier patterns of grains than would be present in, say, processed pasta, or also in things like pizza, where we use white flour often to make the base. Pasta can also be consumed in this area. And we talk about al dente pasta, which is better than overcooked pasta, because the minute you overcook pasta, it actually becomes um, more akin to processed pasta and has a higher glycemic index, which we'll talk about in a minute. You can also add healthy fats, which can be virgin olive oil. It can include hemp seeds, canola oil, nuts, as well as ground flax seeds. I'm a big proponent of smoothies for breakfast, and I usually add a few tablespoons of flax to my smoothies. That means that I have to drink them really quickly, otherwise they get too thick, but they're definitely a helpful thing to do. And then similarly, there's fish and seafood in anti-inflammatory diet. There's whole soy foods, which is edamame, soy nuts, tofu, tempeh. For any of you who haven't had tofu or tempeh, there's wonderful ways of eating those, and you should definitely try that. Asian mushrooms are another thing that are recommended. Typically, a lot of us like portobello mushrooms, and actually portobello mushrooms increase inflammation in the body. So those should be had in moderation and reduced, and instead having Asian mushrooms is a better thing to do. Other sources of protein can be used. You can use herbs to flavor your food and to make it taste better. Also white or green tea. Some supplements, we usually say food is better than supplements, but supplements are also helpful if you're not being able to meet your needs via food. You can have a mode and mood. So this is what I was mentioning when we were talking about the past. Weight of the food that you're eating multiplied by the glycemic index, which basically says how much total carbohydrate load you have in your food. And a high glycemic load diet is actually associated with worsening of mood. So that's the bottom line. Trying to have a lot of processed carbohydrates, that's really the reason a lot of those diets I mentioned right up front tend to encourage not having carbohydrates. But I think they try not to differentiate between good carbs and bad carbs. And so that's really the part that anti-inflammatory diet tends to highlight a little bit better. And there was also a large study which showed that women who had high glycemic index foods could have a higher risk factor for depression. So it does impact women a lot more. And so when you hear some of us saying, I'm emotionally eating, or you hear about, somebody saying, I had just a lot of carbs yesterday, I feel kind of icky, my mood's off, that really does have some biologic bases in there. There was a project called the Mood Food Project that showed a lot of details around how food impacts our mood. Um, and this is really what the Mood Food stood for. And they did this beautiful diagram which shows that food intake and behavior actually has that relationship with depression. It also has a relationship with obesity, obviously, and that obesity also has a relationship with depression. So people who are overweight and may fall under the obese behaviors as well as your mood. So we'll talk a little bit more about this in detail. The food index, and it actually showed that that was affected by emotional eating. It also showed that a typical Tuscan diet, which is the Mediterranean diet, may be protective against depressive symptoms. So I feel like I'm starting to repeat a lot of things now. And the one interesting finding it had that was more specific to men was that men with low vitamin D levels were twice as likely to be depressed as compared to men with higher vitamin level to be 50 or over to really protect against. People who were overweight and depressed, they tended to have worse cognitive function, and that they tended to have greater impacts on their memory and their ability to think through things, and also worsened outcomes when it came to mental health conditions. And then it also showed that leptin dysregulation, so leptin is a specific um, hormone that's present, and that if there was resistance to leptin, then there may be associations both with obesity as well as having depression with atypical features, which usually is feeling the need to sleep a lot, feeling low energy, feeling like your limbs are really heavy, and often is also associated with weight gain. Other findings of mood food that may be interesting. It showed that there was association between major depressive disorder as well as BMI, especially increased BMI. And it also showed that depressed or anxious folks who were on antidepressants actually did a little bit better when it came to their association with insulin growth factor, which essentially aids in weight gain in case they have that. I'm just getting a message that you're losing my audio once in a while. So let me quickly pause and see if you're hearing me right now or not. Okay, and Lila is saying that you are being able to hear me now. Okay, we'll move back on. The current work or the most recent work in mood food shows that they have developed a prevention trial based on the results that they found. And the goal is really to be able to develop information that can be distributed to individuals so that they can really develop some nutritional strategies for themselves and be able to impact their well-being. And that's really part of the reason I do this work, and I wanted to give this talk, is to really give mental health back to the individuals rather than keeping it only with healthcare people. And they're going to be doing 4 different intervention groups. One will be a control condition. The other one will be a placebo with food behavioral change, which is that they'll only ask people to do changes in their food, how they consume food and what they eat. The third one is going to be a multi-nutrient supplement without any food changes. And the fourth one is going to likely be one of the kind of most robust ones, which will have not only a supplement, but also food behavioral change. And so I'm really intrigued to see what that shows, and I'll hopefully, look at that data and be able to present it again in this type of format. So we'll switch from here into doing some myths or facts, and then if you have any questions, please start typing those out also so that we can address those in the last 5 minutes of this presentation. So first, myth or fact. Higher vitamin D levels are associated with significantly decreased risks of current depression. So what would your answer be? I know I've spoken a lot about this today. So that is a fact in subjects with a prior history of depression. So if you've had a history of depression, then your vitamin D levels become even more important because we want to make sure that they're above that 50 millimoles so that we can reduce your risk of further depression. It seems that if a person does not have a history of a depressive episode, then there is no association. And for anybody who's looking to improve their vitamin D levels, ways to do it through food is by consuming fatty fish. You can also have beef liver if you develop a taste for it. Back in the day when I used to eat meat, I didn't quite find that yummy, but I know that people do. Then there's cheese also, which can have good levels of vitamin D. This should not be processed cheese, then usually more the fresh cheese that you can even get at your grocery store, but like the little slices that we put in our sandwiches are typically not a great source. Egg yolks are a good source of vitamin D. Mushrooms, especially, I think, if you could have those Asian mushrooms, which are also anti-inflammatory, tofu, and then just getting sunlight. And the trick with sunlight for vitamin D is that you need to have your upper part of the chest, face, and arms bare when you stand in the sun, and you need to get that for 20 minutes without any sunscreen. So again, your dermatologist may get a little anxious by me telling you to go out in the sun without your sunscreen, but it's really only for 20 minutes. If you're going to be on a lake or a beach or somewhere else for long periods of time, definitely wear your sunscreen. I'm not going to get into trouble with your dermatologist right there. Another myth or fact: all individuals or patients with deficient MTHFR activity should receive supplementation with 5-methyl tetrahydrofolate. So this is that activity that people may assess on a GeneSight or Genomind, so those pharmacogenomic testing that we can do, where they give you the red, orange, and green activities of whether you have good activity or not. So this, interestingly, is a myth. Some physicians will make you have methyl hydrofolate supplementation even if you just have lower activity. But in all the research that's been done around it, it seems that really getting a homocysteine level is very important. And it's typically that homocysteine, if it's low, that then we should do more of that genetic analysis to see if your function is lower. And if your homocysteine level is low and then your MTHFR activity is also low, that's when we may recommend that you get supplementation with 5-methyl tetrahydrofolate. There is a brand name for this supplement, which I know a lot of people use and some physicians ask you to use, and that's okay. But I think really getting this level of testing to see if you really need it is important before you go ahead and start taking that supplementation. If you are taking that supplementation, it doesn't do you any harm. But again, I think it's just trying to see where your time, energy, and money is being spent. And then another myth or fact: the American Psychiatric Association stated that all patients with mood, impulse control, or psychotic disorders should consume 1 gram of EPA plus DHA per day. So EPA and DHA are forms of omega-3 fatty acids, and this is a fact. So EPA greater to or equal than 60% of total EPA plus DHA, so it needs to be about 2/3, showed benefits against depression. And so if you are taking fish oil or omega supplements, you want to make sure that you look at your bottle and see if it gives you a EPA DHA ratio. And you typically want the EPA to be 2/3 and the DHA to be less than 1/3. And typically you want the total amount to be about 2 grams per day. The kind of supplement we carry here at Sierra Tucson, I usually have to do 2 capsules twice a day to make that adequate. Other ways that you can get omega-3 fatty acids is through cold water fatty fish. Again, same thing as vitamin D. Oysters, walnuts, hemp seed, chia seed, flax seed, canola oil, and fortified foods. Great. So here we come to our takeaway points, which is that nutrition plays an important role in both physical and mental health. In mental health settings, we can use dietitians to start affecting lifestyle change. We do that here at Sierra Tucson, and I hope that even in your work outside, you can continue to see a dietitian in case you have questions about some of the things we've discussed. We typically want to focus on an anti-inflammatory dietary pattern, increasing sustainable whole foods, plant-based options, while reducing processed foods, red meat, alcohol, as well as high density, low nutritional content foods. And then finally, food is better than supplements, but either is better than nothing. And here we go to questions and comments. I'm going to quickly pull out my question tab as I have been instructed to do. And then we will see what questions have come through. Okay. I apologize for the few minutes I was not being able to be heard. I hope that we can answer anything that came out in that time frame, and hopefully that our recording caught most of the audio and we'll be making that available. So one question here is, what is an example of Asian mushrooms? So Asian mushrooms are usually straw mushrooms. They're the really kind of stringy ones. You can also get other mushrooms that are just labeled Asian mushrooms in the grocery store. And now I'm blanking on the one form that I like a lot, but I'm sure the minute I move on to the next question, I will think about it. Okay, I have gotten a lot of comments about me not being heard for about those 5 minutes. So, I hear you. So somebody says, would appreciate a recommendation for EPA and DHA supplement for children, preferably vegetarian. So I usually won't give recommendation for specific brands, but you can reach out to me and I can give you some options. This was from Sarah. So Sarah, feel free to email me. I'll maybe move on to the next slide, which has my email, and I can give you some options there. Usually on a presentation, I try not to give brand names. But if you have a local food store, you can definitely just go there and look at the options that they have. And then as long as it says that the EPA and DHA ratio is okay, you should be good. Okay, and then somebody asked, Lisa Marie asked, why are portobello mushrooms inflammatory? That's really not something that's known, but we do notice that individuals who consume portobello mushrooms, I think it may be a lot of the ways that they have been modified over time and the way that they're grown. But portobello mushrooms typically increase inflammatory reactions amongst human beings. I was very, very disappointed when I heard that because I definitely love trying to make burgers with portobello mushrooms. So now I still do it. I just try to do it less than I do with the Asian mushrooms that I consume. Then Janice asked, as far as vitamin D goes, can you receive it as a supplement? Yes, you can. And the good thing with vitamin D is that there's not really a huge qualitative difference in the vitamin D supplements. They all come from one essential source, so whichever vitamin D supplement you get is good. Typically, you may want to get your vitamin D levels checked before you start doing a supplement, because vitamin D is a fat-soluble vitamin, so it doesn't get excreted from your body very easily. And so if you are consuming high amounts of vitamin D, you can actually get toxic on it. And it does have pretty significant impacts if you have toxic levels of vitamin D. Somewhere between 50 to 70 is an ideal range when it comes to mental health. So trying to get your levels assessed is good. And then Bethany asked, will weight gain due to psych meds be helped by this diet? Typically, yes. And I think the psychiatric medications that usually cause weight gain or are associated with weight gain are definitely the older and maybe not older, but the second generation antipsychotic medications, um, some mood stabilizers, etc. And we do notice that when individuals are able to reduce their inflammatory load, improve the diet, that weight gain does improve. There's also some studies, again, this is not individual, doctor-patient information. You should check this with your physician before doing this, but there are some medications which are used for folks with early onset diabetes or to support diabetic treatment that have been associated with improvement in that weight gain and have a better side effect profile than having a really high weight. And then we have another person who says, or do you intake the items that contain D but need sunlight to activate it? So sunlight actually helps vitamin D be produced within your body. And the items that contain vitamin D are ways to supplement vitamin D through your diet. So definitely you can do a supplement, but you can also improve your vitamin D levels just with food. Okay, and yes, thank you, Robin, for reminding me that shiitake mushrooms are the ones that are Asian mushrooms too, and reishi, yes. Lisa Marie, thank you for coming up with that, reishi and shiitake mushrooms. Shiitake are some of my favorites because if you cut them really small and kind of fry them, they actually taste a little bit like fish, especially. So sometimes I add that just when I'm trying to make fish tacos or something to get more of that fish feeling, though I don't consume fish as much anymore. And then another person says, I have found that high intake of processed foods and sugar negatively impacts my clients. I'm unsure why eating well is not being recommended more by physicians, psychiatrists, etc. I think a lot of physicians are not taught about diet. And that was one of the big pushes for me to go and do my integrative medicine fellowship. And sometimes we can become really narrowly focused just on medications and doing the things we are told to do. But I do think that any of you who are working with clients should definitely, and patients should encourage a better diet. And if you yourself are just tuning in to take care of your health, encouraging yourself and your family members to eat healthy foods and reduce the impact of processed foods is important. One of the things that comes to me is I met somebody who was really beating down a vegan diet. And so I asked them when they tried it. They're like, oh, back in college. And I'm like, what did you eat? And all they ate were Oreos, which surprisingly are vegan, and then crackers and things like that. So being vegan with eating a lot of vegetables and having high plant-based intake is one thing, and doing that just with Oreos is different, which is why I think some of the dietary pieces which are just introduced with kind of catchy names sometimes are not enough. So what does EPA and DHA stand for? So those are components of omega-3s, like I said, and they have fairly long names. I'm sure you can Google them. And then, can you over supplement vitamin C? Vitamin C is something that usually you can't over supplement because it does get excreted, but some people do notice that it can have a little bit of negative impact. If you're eating a lot of citrus fruits and such, it can damage your teeth. So you want to be a little bit careful, and then balancing the timing of when you consume the vitamin C supplements or citrus fruits and do your brushing. So I have been asked to end the presentation, and I know that we were a few minutes over, but I wanted to make up for the time you couldn't hear me. Thank you again for joining us, and this is my email address. And then there's also, I'm also trying to be more active on social media, so if you have any questions, feel free to send those to me on social media platforms. I'm fairly active on LinkedIn, Instagram, and I'm trying to learn about Twitter next. So if you have any tips about that, feel free to send those my way as well. And thank you so much for joining in and sticking with us even when the audio was a little shaky. Bye-bye.